am speaking from the traditional lands of the Ohlone people here in Oakland, California, and pay my respect to the indigenous elders, both past and present. I'd also like to pay homage to our African ancestors on whose shoulders we stand. Good afternoon. My name is Anitra Smith. I'm a program officer with Sunlight Giving and a member of the Black Funders Network Advisory Board. Welcome to today's program, a fireside chat with Darren Walker. We're pleased to host each of you here. And as it turns out, this is our best attended event to date. So give yourselves a hand. So let me take this opportunity to briefly introduce us. The Black Funders Network of the Bay Area was founded in 2019. Drawing inspiration from our predecessor, BayBib, the network enables philanthropic professionals to connect, re-energize, and align to best support Black communities and organizations across disciplines. Our network includes nearly 120 Black identified funder colleagues connected through our LinkedIn group platform. Our program aims to complement and align with the work of our big sibling organizations, APFI and Northern California grantmakers. We want to give a special shout out to our Cornerstone campaign supporters. Thank you very much, whose commitments to Black communities help us propel our work. The Black Funders Network has an exciting launch coming next month, so please stay tuned for more information. We will share those deeds with you all. And if you would like to learn more about us, please reach out at hello@blackfundersnetwork.org. Now for a bit of housekeeping. The program is being recorded. If you haven't already, please introduce yourself in the chat. Please have your cameras on if you're willing and your mics off. And to make this program more accessible, we have enabled closed captioning. You're welcome to use the closed caption button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to turn your subtitles on or off based on your accessibility needs. If you have any questions during the program, please DM them to Nicole Giles and she will address them during the Q&A portion. It is my pleasure to introduce those who will carry the conversation forward this afternoon. Our co-moderators today are both Chelsea Seabron and Rodney Nickens Jr. Chelsea is a manager at google.org, where she focuses on employee philanthropy and skilled volunteering programs with a lens towards diversity, equity, and inclusion. Prior to Google, as an associate at Booz Allen Hamilton, Chelsea championed federal grant projects, including the Broadband Technology Opportunity Program. In her spare time, Chelsea serves as a faith-based minister leader with her husband, who is the co-founder of Bridge Good, formerly known as Oakland Digital. And she recently joined the board of directors for California Volunteers Fund. Next, Rodney is the program officer for policy and innovation at the San Francisco Foundation, where he manages a grant-making portfolio and policy and advocacy to ensure low-income residents in the Bay Area have a safe and affordable place to call home and thrive. Rodney currently serves on the board of directors for New Leaders Council Oakland, the Greenlining Institute Academy Alumni Association, and the Regional Planning Committee at the Association of Bay Area Governments. And our special guest is Darren Walker. Darren is president of the Ford Foundation, a $14 billion international social justice philanthropy. Under his leadership, the Ford Foundation became the first nonprofit in US history to issue a $1 billion designated social bond in US capital markets for proceeds to strengthen and stabilize nonprofit organizations in the wake of COVID-19. Before joining Ford, Darren was vice president at the Rockefeller Foundation, overseeing global and domestic programs. In the 1990s, he was COO of the AntiAsian Development Corporation, Harlem's largest community development organization. Darren co-founded both the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance and the President's Council on Disability, Inclusion, and Philanthropy. He serves on many boards, including Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, the National Gallery of Art, Carnegie Hall, the High Line, the Committee to Protect Journalists, and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, as well as the corporate boards of both Square and Ralph Lauren. He is the recipient of 16 honorary degrees and university awards, y'all, including Harvard University's W.E.D. Du Bois Medal. Most recently, Darren was named Wall Street Journal's 2020 Philanthropy Innovator. And that's not even his full bio, y'all, which you can find in the chat. Please join me in welcoming Chelsea, Rodney, and Darren.
What is the role of senior leaders in philanthropy, such as yourself and others, in mentoring folks like myself and Chelsea and others who are coming behind you? And how can we do a better job of building the bench so that we're not closing the door behind us? But also, what are some examples from your own life of mentoring and being mentored that you think have made the most impact on you and have helped you to be where you are today?
Well, I think I've been very lucky because I have had really good mentorship. And that mentorship has been very different. So when I was at a law firm, when I was at a bank, my mentors were straight white men who were really committed to my development and my success, and understood me in my totality and encouraged me to be me. And so I found those mentors, again, not by sort of saying, oh, would you be my mentor, but through the cultivation of relationships. And it's something that I think we often in those settings don't always feel equipped. We haven't been coached. I mean, my mother never could coach me. No one in my family had ever worked in a professional setting as a professional. And so I didn't have the coaching. And so I had to, as an observer, be very observant and be very curious about how relationships translate into propelling your career forward. And that's, for me, what I learned and what I cultivated. So there's no doubt that I cultivated people, and I cultivated a diverse array of people for those mentorships. And as I said, when I came into philanthropy, there wasn't anybody Black at the Rockefeller Foundation. Julia was a great mentor. As a lesbian Latina, she understood, and we had a real simpatico. And she was very hard on me in some ways because I did not understand this whole philanthropy thing, and the Rockefeller Foundation couldn't be more different than Abyssinian Development Corporation, right? I'm working on a basement on 138th Street, and all of a sudden I'm in a corner office on Fifth Avenue with I worked at a place where everybody was Black, and a month later, everybody's white except for me. And so it's a very different experience. And I think the ability to be nimble enough and adaptive enough, I do think that that's one of those qualities, a quality to adapt and adjust, and recognize that developing that is critical. And part of that adaptation and adjustment is being able to figure out the coping that comes with the frustration of trying to adapt and adjust, right? And I think that's one of the things that I have been challenged. And I do think, though, that, there have been times in my career when I have literally wanted to tell my colleague, my supervisor, my president, what I thought of them. I really came so close on many occasions. But my own internal antenna always said, take the high road. And I think sometimes there is satisfaction in taking the low road because people will bring us to the low road really easily because a lot of people live on that low road. And you have to really keep your eye on the prize, right? I mean, there are so many occasions when I look back now when I just sucked it up and put on my pleasant face and nodded and or kept it to myself. And I'm glad I did. There is a cost for that, just to be clear. There is a cost that comes from not telling people exactly what you think of them sometimes when it's really warranted. But if you believe that ultimately you will prevail, then that's the point, right? You know, absolutely. I had a situation where literally something happened to me in the middle, well, right at the beginning of when I was being interviewed to be president of Ford. And I had an opportunity to tell a very important person what I thought of him because he pushed me there. But I thought to myself, you know what, if I use the number of expletives I would like to use right now in responding to you, it will probably do harm to my career and to people's perceptions of me in this room right now with what you just did. So I will. And so it worked. I mean, you know, ultimately I fired that person. And so, you know, I'm happy that I was able on my turn and not be dragged down to the low road, like at a strategic point in my career, because I could have easily, and people would have justified, actually, people would have said what you know, telling him what you thought, actually, you were justified. But ultimately, I prevailed.
Woo! I mean, I'm just gonna take a moment to process that, but really, that grit and that grace is a true talent that you possess. So as we transition into our next question for you, Darren, I can't leave what you just said about being sometimes the only Black person. So our next question is really around how can leaders in philanthropy, especially Black staff, serve as a bridge between philanthropy and social justice movements? And how can we leverage opportunities to better bring resources to the movements and our communities? And you spoke about that tax also showing up as the Black person within community. It's so nuanced. Really excited to hear how you've navigated that and how we can continue to navigate that well and in service to our movement leaders.
Well, that's a really layered question, of course, that I start using my philanthropy speak. But it is truly layered because, first of all, Chelsea, you assume that philanthropy is interested in social justice. And I would disabuse you of the idea that philanthropy writ large is interested in justice. I think philanthropy is interested in philanthropy, is interested in what I would call the difference between optimizing and transforming, right? So most of philanthropy, in my view, is interested in optimizing the current tools and structures of philanthropy. And I actually am interested in disrupting and transforming the structures and system of philanthropy. And there is a difference. And I think part of the challenge is philanthropy as a sector is basically pretty status quo. In spite of our rhetoric, right? So in spite of the rhetoric about DEI and Black Lives Matter and all the Academy Award winning Golden Globe nominations, performances last summer by so many people, at the end of the day, for a lot of folks, it was just that, performance. And so the reality is we have to really think seriously about the difference between generosity and justice. And for those folks who are really interested in justice, it is much more challenging to do philanthropy. I think for those of us who are Black in our work environments, I think having people, our white colleagues, understand that we have to have what Du Bois talked about, the sort of dual existence that we live, bringing them along on the journey of understanding that duality, of understanding that we consciously live under the white gaze and what that means. Having those kinds of conversations is very important. And to do it in a way that is invitational, not lecturing, right? So not pedantic, not like, oh, you stupid white person, you don't understand, I have to live under your gaze. No, it's not to say that. But it is to say, I want you to come on the journey with me to understand where I sit in this conversation or in this room. And to have that level of conversation that, as I say, is invitational and that acknowledges that for many whites who want to be on the journey, they are vulnerable on that journey. They want to be on the journey, but they're vulnerable because they know that they don't have the tools, that they have not been trained, acculturated, given the support to actually be anti-racist, to actually understand empathetically what it is to be Black in this country. So they don't have and so that journey for them is fraught because, in fairness, for some it is fraught. And there are examples when well-meaning people have used the wrong word or been mistaken in terms of for what, or made an ignorant, remark, and not reflecting malice or an intent, but been heavily penalized for that error, of naive error, benign error, whatever it may have been. It wasn't intended with harm or malice or evil, or it wasn't intended that way. But they saw this person was fired. This person got in a lot of trouble for being on the journey and being white on the journey and not knowing and not understanding or making a mistake. So one of the things that we have a responsibility to do is to say, we also have to give those whites who want to be on the journey the space to make mistakes and to understand that those mistakes are actually not surprising. I mean, it's not surprising. I remember my dearly beloved late partner, who grew up in incredible privilege and incredible, I mean, on one of our first dates, I had a friend and he said, "Oh, your Oriental friend." And I said, "Oriental? Like, what are you talking about?" And he literally, because growing up in but he had it wasn't, he was just using the term that was culturally familiar and in his context. I was appalled and thought I was shocked. But my point is just, I didn't say you're an idiot. I mean, I said, you gotta get your language right here. This is not cool, right? But it was a conversation that helped him broaden his understanding and be awakened to how language is used in hurtful, mean-spirited ways, and to have a level of sensitivity that he had not had, that then allowed him not just but broadly to understand things. So I say that to say, it's just a way of both acknowledging to our white colleagues, I need you to understand me. And I also understand that I'm going to have to understand you. And yes, I can make assumptions that you don't know, that you don't have, but I need you to be on the journey. I mean, at the end of the day, we need allies. All of us need allies. We need brown allies. We need indigenous allies. We need white allies. Anybody who genuinely wants to be on the journey with us, we want them to be on the journey.
Right. That's a great segue to a question that we have from the chat. As we're thinking about, how we best leverage opportunities to bring resources back to our communities, to have these conversations and to build the capacity for our organizations. One of the participants is interested in learning a little bit more from you, Darren, about how the Ford Foundation is supporting Black-led coalitions and organizations and building the capacity of those leaders and those movements.
I think this is where, the rubber really hits the road and it becomes really challenging, right? This is where the abstraction of equity, racial equity, and the reality of legacy practices that privilege white-led organizations, organizations with long histories or long relationships with a particular foundation or company, how that incumbency privileges those incumbents. And this is the issue of power rests with those incumbents. And it is very challenging if you aren't willing to truly embrace equity. And this is where I think, don't talk about equity if you don't mean it, because equity is going to require you to change. And so stop. It's not a fad, and it's not like a trend that you can. It's serious business, this equity stuff, and so for me, what it does, and I talk about it, and to give examples. So the Ford Foundation, makes over 1,500 grants a year, and well over half of those grants, and in some programs, more than 2/3 of those grants are to BIPOC and women-led organizations. And even within particular portfolios like the racial justice portfolio, yes, we have the LDF and the large, but you also want the grassroots groups, and you want, and so having a particular conversation about, are we funding women-led, feminist-led Black grassroots organizations, right? So we just announced a $15 million Black Feminist Fund. In part, that grew out of those conversations, right? And so not only creating funds like that to hopefully raise money, but within the portfolios, then making individual grants to those organizations. And so I think giving a concrete program strategy. So an example would be, we announced recently in our America's Cultural Treasures initiative, the national program. We put in 50, and then we raised another 40. But part of, and so my job was to convince Bloomberg, Alice Walter, the various people who we got to give the 40, that actually funding the way Ford was funding, which was through a racial justice, through a BIPOC strategy, was what we needed to do. So the way that program looked when it was announced was really interesting, right? So the organizations, let's just say the Whitney Museum got $500,000, and the Studio Museum got $6.5 million. Lincoln Center got $1 million. The Apollo got $7 million, right? So that's equity, right? So when people are like, well, what, you're like, this is what equity looks like. So, New York City Ballet didn't get anything, and Dance Theater of Harlem got $5 million. And that's not to say that I love New York City Ballet. I was on the board of New York City. I love them. But New York City Ballet is going to be okay. It is a challenge, but they have a $250 million endowment, and Dance Theater of Harlem is a treasure. They barely have an endowment and live hand to mouth. And they have done in the last 3 years amazing work as a board and an organization to build their resilience. And that should be rewarded, because they've done that without any billionaires on their board. They've done it without a long list of individual donors who give them, six-figure gifts on a regular basis, or leave them, their Hamptons house in their will. I mean, they don't have that at DTH. So that's what equity looks like. And I think sometimes when you present that to people, but on the other hand, I'm encouraged because when we presented this program, and as I said, there were a number of national donors who had never funded that way, who, like I said, gave $40 million amongst that group. Mackenzie Scott, her most recent, well, both of her rounds of grants, which are in the billions now, when you look at the portfolio, it's all racial equity. I mean, she is totally doing racial equity in the work. And there are other philanthropists who are doing that. And I think the more people like me, talk about that, I think absolutely on climate. I mean, we didn't want to talk about climate because that's another whole issue of the whole environmental ecosystem, which is absolutely problematic from the standpoint of equity and race. It will be interesting to see what happens with Mr. Bezos's fund, because I know that there have been lots of outreaches to some Black leaders I have known in the environmental justice movement from that the new head of that organization. I know that there are other people working on climate to come into the climate space because it has been, I mean, the Ford Foundation was at ground zero with helping to build the EJ movement, in part as a response to the 60s environmental Sierra Club, NRDC, the whole white ecosystem, conservation, et cetera, that ignored the environmental injustices happening and worked on building conservancies to keep people from developing around their neighborhoods as priorities for the environment. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, and that's why we have to call that out.
Speaking of just calling out, Darren, when you, the inflection point of the season that the world is in right now about responding in solidarity and support for our AAPI communities, as a Black leader, how do you show up in moments like this where there's no easy way to say this, but at times where there's, the aggressor might be Black. And so by responding, you also might not untangle, but you have to hold both the importance of supporting the AAPI community and, advancing the work for the Black portfolios that you've stood up, right? And how sometimes shining a light on that, as you described, other members of your philanthropy may not have the ability to hold both moments without saying, well, let's not do Black funding anymore. So how do you advance the work and mitigate potential negative effects on progress made towards the Black racial justice and equity outcomes while still showing up in solidarity for other movements?
Right. I mean, so Chelsea, those are not oppositional ideas, and although some would see them, right? I think, first of all, as I said before, the issue of allyship is not just about us. I mean, it is very problematic what is happening in terms of the anti-Asian hate in this country. Of course, it has been fomented in the last year, 18 months, by our leader, and the consequences of the brazen cruelty that was exhibited, we are living with. And so a lot of folks are responding to that kind of cruelty, looking for scapegoats. And the scapegoat happens to be anybody who is Asian. And the perpetrators are of every race. Black folks aren't, we aren't exempt from cruelty towards other people of color. And so we have to own that and name that and call that out, because our future and destiny is connected to theirs. And I actually think we have to speak up. when we see that happen. And it's one of the things in reaching out and speaking to Asian leaders, have really, I mean, it's almost been like therapy session with some of the Asian leaders, because, I mean, there was one wealthy Asian who said very, I am not equipped. I wasn't ready. I mean, my parents told me, immigrants told me, yes, if someone calls you names, if someone, just keep your head down and don't tell the teacher about it. Don't tell anyone. Just focus on your SAT and getting into Harvard, right? I mean, like that was what she was taught, and she never developed the capacity to call out injustice perpetrated against herself or other Asians. Now, this is a person who has given generously to Black causes, let's just say. And yet she thought that she was exempt in some way, and is learning the power of white supremacy, and thought that because of her proximity to whiteness, she would be insulated from what we experience, and is learning very quickly, but is without the tools, because, as she said, we're all raised with a consciousness in this country. We have to be on some level. When you are of that status, something else happens. And so I think we have to call that out. We have to name that, and we have to work to encourage that consciousness for justice for their community. And it is a real challenge for the AAPI community right now, because they are having to quickly ramp up, because they have been under-resourced in terms of, I mean, the frailty of so many of the Asian rights organizations who I meet with and we fund and I hear all the time, and have organized and am organizing a meeting in a couple of weeks that will bring together some of the traditional philanthropies who fund Black justice issues, to also fund these issues around, and also to bring some of those Asian billionaires who don't fund, who are giving money to Stanford and for fellowships and great. I'm not knocking that, but I'm saying, you all need to have the same consciousness that we have. Okay. I mean, and that doesn't exist. I mean, it just doesn't exist the way. I mean, I know that I can walk right out onto Park Avenue, and I would not for a minute presume that I'm like my white neighbors walking out onto Park Avenue and going on about my business. And I think for a lot of successful Asian Americans, they think that they can walk out and be just like their white neighbors and nothing, and be shocked that someone, when they go down to the subway, is going to like push them onto or attack them or whatever, the things that have happened in New York City. And so they're now living with that fear. So we need to be reaching out to them, talking about how they cope and how we support them and each other in a collective, because it is all, at the end of the day, so much of this is rooted in the reality of white supremacy. And this is so hard in philanthropy to talk about. I gave a speech in Texas, and afterwards to these philanthropists, and I got in trouble afterwards. This guy, he comes up to me and he's like, you have to be really careful. This is an offensive term, and you're making people feel it's a turnoff, Darren. And I was like, oh my gosh, because I want to connect and get people to. And I was thinking about, like, how do I, do I use bias, discrimination, whatever? And then I was having dinner with Charles Blow, and I was explaining to Charles, who will use far more difficult language. And I said, so what do you use instead of white supremacy and blah, blah? And he's like, why are you stressing about using white supremacy? White people came up with the term white supremacy. It's their term. Why are you stressing about? And he said, the constitutions of 12 states in this country, conventions were called, and literally the headline of the meeting was, "We are here to instantiate white supremacy into the Constitution of the state of Alabama." And to the state, like, they use the term. Like, why are you trying to like, and it was really liberating to like, understand that actually I'm playing back to white people something they said to us. Right. And so I think we have to just be candid about that. And it does offend some people, and especially in philanthropy, especially older philanthropists. And that's because these philanthropists, when you start talking about inequality, white supremacy, white privilege, people recoil because they begin to engage in their own culpability and the complicity that they bring to the very problem they're trying to solve. And in the reality of this narrative that I started with nothing, I mean, how many successful white men have I heard tell me, my situation was no different than yours. I had a single mother too, Darren, and I didn't know my father, and blah blah blah, or all the stories that I've been told, and the reason they don't want to engage in that conversation is because they believe that they started with nothing, one, and they now are a billionaire, and so America has to be fair. I mean, yes, there's some problems, but on the whole, it's a pretty fair country. And so if that's what's in the person's head and you say, actually, it's rigged, it's kind of rigged. People are, no, they don't want to go there because it implicates them in the injustice, right? It's like Dr. King said about philanthropy. Philanthropy is commendable, but it should not allow the philanthropist to overlook the economic injustice, which makes philanthropy necessary. And so when Dr. King was saying, he was saying something very different than Carnegie and Rockefeller, who talked about charity and generosity and all these nice things that made them feel good. And Dr. King was actually saying, stop, don't feel so good about yourselves just yet, because you are part of the problem that you are trying to solve. And so
that's right.
That's the real challenge for a lot of people who, when we try to engage in philanthropy with our boards, for example, and you see people start to do this, when you start to talk, as I have experienced on many occasions, that's why.
That is so powerful. We could just drop the mic there. We are gonna wrap up, though. We are running short on time. We have about 5 minutes left in our program this afternoon, Darren. But thank you. This has just been so inspiring. I know we're all holding so much right now in this period of continued racial reckoning in our country, as we witness just so many egregious acts of injustice perpetrated against our communities, the devastating loss of life. And so, Darren, I'm just wondering if you have any last thoughts or any words of wisdom or inspiration for folks who are just really, we've been through a lot this past year. And
no, I mean, look, Cedric, I think it is very easy over these last few years to, on any given day, be depressed, demoralized, dejected by what we have had to witness on a daily basis. The vulgarity, the vileness, the cruelty, the inhumanity that we have had to witness on a daily basis is so dispiriting. And yet, I am often reminded of, in spite of our challenges, how privileged we are. And when we think about our parents and our grandparents, I assure you, they could never have imagined the lives that we lead. They could never have imagined, being a manager at a big company like Google, they could never have a man. They might have cleaned the offices at Google, but they weren't going to be a manager at Google. They weren't going to be president of a foundation. And I think about that a lot. I think about the blood, the lives that have been lost. I think about Fannie Lou Hamer, poor, Black, sterilized without her consent. I think about so many. And when I think about what they went through, and they persevered, they persisted, they were determined, and they knew that in their lifetimes, they were never going to see justice. But they still persevered. And, you know, Langston Hughes's great poem, my favorite poem, Let America Be America, again, and when he starts in the first stanza and he says, let America be America again. America never was America to me. And he is voicing the rage and anger he has at America for the rhetoric of the land of the free, the home of the brave, and all of that stuff, in contrast with his lived experience as a Black man in Harlem in 1932 when he wrote that poem. But he ends in the last stanza by saying, but oh yes, someday America will be. So Langston Hughes had both rage and anger at America, but he actually had some belief and hope and dream that someday we could actually reach a point where justice is being delivered in this country for Black people. We are clearly not there, especially given this week. But for those of us who live our privileged lives, who live with relative comfort, who, when we consider our plight, as opposed to most people in this country who have lived through a pandemic, certainly most Black people who have lived through this pandemic, when literally in the African American community, billions of dollars have been lost. Small businesses eradicated. The numbers of Black women who have lost their jobs, the numbers are sobering. And so I better get my ass up out of bed every day and suit up, because my situation is in no way worthy of any pity, any sympathy, any pouting, any slow walking. There is work to do, people.
Thank you for that. And on that note,
we gotta suit up.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Darren. I think that that's so powerful. And I just, as we come to a close, we have 3 minutes left. Thank you so much for your wisdom, your leadership. And I want everyone to please join me in thanking Darren Walker, Chelsea Seabron, and Rodney Nickens Jr. for today's fantastic conversation. I think a personal takeaway from me is that we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors, and it's our duty to continue to call it out, to call out the injustice, and to continue to really, push philanthropy towards a social justice angle. And so thank you for that, your leadership and the work that you're doing in that space. And before we go, please help us in order to help us create more aligned and useful programs, please provide us feedback on this particular program through our post-program survey, which Nicole will drop in the chat. So I just want to say thank you all to everyone for coming. Thank you so much, Darren, for your wisdom, your leadership, and the very re-energizing conversation.
Thank you.